Got it.
There we go. Look at that nice chunk of room tone that I got there as well. I used to not know that you should do that. Have that minute of silence or whatever, a few seconds of silence, I guess. There's no such thing as a minute of silence on this show. We're talking all the time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Plus, a full minute of silence would make for pretty bad audio. As a matter of fact, it's not
I know
recommended.
everyone would be grabbing their phones like, oh, what happened
Hey,
here?
what happened here? It must have shut down. I better turn to my brother and me. So yeah, welcome back. Dylan Schlender is joining me from the Reels of Justice podcast fame, multi-award winning. I'm going to go ahead and call it now.
Yeah, sure. Fame. We've yeah. I'm sure there's some hack award out there we can win.
We should start one. That's
we
what
should. We should. We have our own little, what is it, the Patron Family hashtag. We'll do the Patron Family Awards.
There you go. Patron Family. That's great. Podlings. Yes. That's another one I thought of.
Okay.
Even with the Dark Crystal, nobody calls their listeners podlings. I don't think. I've never heard anyone do it. So,
we're gonna start doing that now. Hello, all you podlings out there. Welcome to the Broken Brain Podcast.
There you go. See, that's a much better professional intro than I usually do.
I mean, people know what they're listening to. So you can't really find it on accident, right? You got to click.
It is interesting. Yeah, for the intro, there always is that feeling of like, and I have, anyone who listens to the show knows there are several where I just start. And it's like, hey, so anyway, we come into the middle of a conversation. So we are chatting today. You came on my live show that I did the broadcast for overdose awareness the other day, a couple weeks ago, something like that, maybe a week ago. I don't understand time, Dylan. Maybe you could help me with this.
Well, it depends. Someone could be listening to this in the year 2025, so it could be several years ago.
That's true. In the post-apocalyptic future that is anytime after today, probably.
Yeah, so yes, we're getting there.
a little pessimistic, but luckily we're talking about something that can help. You mentioned I'm trying to remember who mentioned it first. It doesn't really matter, but
actually, I rewatched the section in preparation for today. So I asked you, because we were talking about overdose, and with your background in therapy, I said, what would be your perfect treatment plan if I gave you a blank check?
There we go.
And part of it you were talking about was trauma mitigation. And as part of that, you had mentioned internal family systems, which really lit me up because I'm actually a very big fan. I should say for the listeners out there, I am a fan. I'm not a therapist. I'm not a doctor. All this conversation from my end is just going to be as an enthusiastic amateur who's done a lot of reading and a lot of working within the system. So don't take anything I'm saying as medical advice or anything like that. I am just a big fan of the ideas, and that's what we're going to be talking about today.
And I'll throw myself on there too. Don't take what I'm saying as medical advice either. I'm not certainly not conducting therapy.
Yeah, you have to say I'm a therapist, but I'm not your therapist.
Not your therapist, right? Yes. Right. Just your host. Just your host and bestest buddy here on the show, everyone. The really interesting thing was for me was talking about internal family systems was that I was introduced to it by my therapist, by a therapist that I was on the other side of the room, sitting in the client chair. It says client on it, big letters. But that was where I was introduced to what was referred to in session. The first time I heard about it was as parts work, which is one way to describe internal family systems. And actually, sometimes if I introduce to people, that's what I'll call it at first, because it's a term that makes a little more sense. And we'll get into why that is. When people hear the word family, they think that this is going to involve other people. But there's a reason why it's named that.
That's true. There is a good reason for the naming convention. Yes, but calling it parts work. So I got introduced to it through my therapist as well when I decided to start seeing a therapist, and he was explaining the level of how this work how we would do it. I said, wow, this sounds kind of far out there. This doesn't sound like, it sounds a little nuts. So as we keep discussing this, bear with us, because it all really does come together. And if you do stick with it, you can do a lot of good work and a lot of healing too. Like going back to what you were saying about trauma, this is stuff that can help you with very serious trauma, or even like just like having a little anxiety because you're going to give a public speech, so it runs that gambit, and it can be very beneficial, whatever you're trying to heal about you. Don't want to say fix, right? Because they're not broken.
You're right. And I think that's that's a great point.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I do like about this is that it really goes into things I believe, which is it's very individualized, it's person centered, and it is also very strength focused, strength positive, I think, because because of the underlying theories that I have here too. And I will say, both of us are pretty much stands for this type of therapy. I think it's a very powerful model.
Yeah.
We're going to be going ahead and talking about it in a positive way. I did look up some criticisms and things, but we may bring that up.
I have a few concerns about some of the popular trends I'm seeing in it, but again, this is coming purely from a layman and more from a balanced point of view. It's just like we don't something like this, I think, is so great and wonderful, but you don't want to get blindsided by a few of the trends that I'm starting to see in it. But we could talk about that towards the end, because everything I have to say is 99% positive.
Yeah, that's me too. And I will say, one of the tendencies people have is when there is a trend or when something's working really well, is to say it's everything and everything and everything. I mean, you see people do that with a lot of different things.
Yeah, that's one of my notes. It's not a panacea,
Yes, but really, and one of the ways you can tell that, because I have people come on my show and talk about different treatment modalities, and I've had some people come on and talk about ketamine treatment and other things like that. And one of the ways you can tell that they're legit is when they talk about it as a piece or a tool in your tool belt or toolbox or whatever. No one wears tool belts anymore, do they?
But from time to time,
Okay.
My son has a little tool belt when we built his birdhouse. It's very cute.
And that's how you can see, because they're not looking at it as a magic panacea or anything like that. But first, I mean, we'll get into a little bit of what it is. That's probably important. I find that it's not the type of therapy that you mentioned and everyone goes, oh yeah, I've totally heard of that. Yeah. Although I am seeing a few more people ask for it proactively as they come into therapy.
Oh, that's great.
So it's catching around somewhere. Someone's talking about it.
Yeah, well, I tell you who's talking about it. The guy who invented it, or he'd probably more say that he discovered it, not so much that he invented it, and that's Richard Schwartz. And he is he basically came up with the system in the 80s when he was working with very high-risk clients, specifically with like eating disorders. And he was noticing a few trends while he was working with those high-risk clients, and that's what led him to develop this system. But Richard Schwartz is still with us. He still does lots of interviews, lots of podcasts. He just wrote he has a few books written, and there's a lot of books written about it. But I guess I should let you explain on a more technical level what internal family systems actually is. So what did Richard Schwartz discover?
And I'll say this, and I've discovered in our chats, you and me, that you've actually read more direct Schwartz stuff than I have. So that's really, really, helpful to have in here. And I've read some of the things that have come off from that. And one of the cool things about it is that the really cool researchers and people who come up with models, I find, are, for lack of a better term, open source in their attitude about it, where they're like, hey, yeah, take this, use it, make a workbook out of it, kind of thing. And I see him endorse a lot of the books people have written about it as well. So I always feel like that's a good sign too. But, the reason that it's called that is that Schwartz was trained as a family therapist with family systems theory. And family systems theory is something that is fascinating in and of itself, but it goes into the idea that if someone presents with a problem into therapy or any kind of mental health treatment and psychological issues, that it is not enough to talk to the person, that you have to talk to the family, right? Salvador Minuchin is one who was really big into this, and there's several others, but maybe we'll do an episode about them sometime. But the idea would be that they'd actually take even like a family genome, some people call it, or just a family chart. And Minuchin, for example, he didn't like to meet with individuals. He would tell people, if someone came in and brought their kid and said, my kid is misbehaving, he'd say, oh, okay, great. So you're here for you to learn how to work with your kid then. And they'd say, no, I want you to teach my kid to behave. And he'd say, well, why are they here? You're the one who needs to teach them to behave. So let's start with both of you. And do any other family members live in the house? They should be here too. And that, that was kind of I don't know, groundbreaking thing in a way. Another a book, if some people want to learn more about family systems, is the Family Crucible, which is it's a narrative nonfiction that tells the story of two therapists working with a particular family, true story with names changed or whatever. And the idea being that even when we're talking, even when they were, if you're a purist, which I don't know if anybody still is, but if you're a purist of that, it would be like, well, if we're talking about any of the relationships, even mom and dad, the youngest child could sit here in the room and be part of it because they already know what's going on anyway. And that's the theory, right? And
Yeah.
that all the people make the parts of the family, and that if someone's like the identified bad guy, that is not necessarily true. That is just the role that they're occupying in the family. This
Yeah.
is where terms come from, like a scapegoat child or a hero child or a whatever.
Yeah, like I forget the exact term I use, but like the adultification of a child too early. Like so this would be like your 10-year-old daughter who like makes breakfast and lunch for the family because the dad's like an alcoholic.
Right.
They have to take on roles that they're not actually equipped to take on.
Yeah. And some of the things that a family systems theorist would say is if you come in and it's like, oh, dad's an alcoholic, and so therefore they
Mhm.
would look at that often and say, okay, well, what role does dad's drinking play in the family? What's being accomplished by that? Right? Because it's like behavior is a solution, not a problem, or at least an attempt at a solution. Right.
Yeah.
And so there's something there. If there's like, oh, one of the family members is really mean and everybody else is tiptoeing around the house, it's like instead of saying, hey, mean family member, stop it, it would be more like, well, what role does being mean serve in the family? What's the attempt? And basically, and this is where it translates into internal family systems. Now, you can't always say this is true for everyone, but family systems likes to look at the theory that every behavior is a form of communication and every behavior plays some kind of intended function. And generally speaking, what we're trying to do is we're trying to be healthy and happy. And if I am, if drinking myself into feeling better every night is part of that, and and at some point that seemed like the right thing to do, maybe that's better than confronting an issue that might wind up in threatening my family. As far as our, if we have to really dig into our problems, some hard decisions and hard discussions might have to be made. So it's better if I'm drunk. Um,
Yeah,
my
exactly.
spouse handles it better anyway.
It's like this idea of maintaining stasis, like the status quo. The internal family system, the external family system, they get into this routine, and that's where they like to stand. And anything that basically threatens that routine, that's what activates these bad behaviors to keep
Oh,
things like to keep the quo status.
yeah, exactly. And you see people that will react very strongly to a therapist, even intimating that, well, if so and so is really mean and everyone's scared, if this kid is terrorizing the household, the 16-year-old's throwing tantrums and yelling at everybody and everybody's ducking and covering. Well, this kid is the scapegoat kid, or they play some role as trying to investigate it. Even the suggestion that the behavior plays a role instead of the kid just being easily identified as a bad kid, people will push back like crazy. It's where you'll get people come in the next session and say, well, I have 53 examples of what he did this week. It's like, if I'm doing family systems, I don't want to talk about that. I want to
Yeah.
talk about the role that the deeper behavior plays. So, Schwartz, we'll get into where the application goes. He looked at that and said, okay, there's this external relationships that are completely outside ourselves, and you work with the whole family, great. But what's going on internal? And one of the things I really like about it is that it sort of plays with the concept of the inner child, which is sort of a pop psychology term that everybody knows. And, we see it depicted on movies and TV, I think, where it's like, just the, I don't know, same thing that's usually on those, which is just your inner child and this and that. And therapy's kind of silly. But this takes it to a next level where it's like you don't just have an inner child, you've got an inner family. You've got
Yes.
all of these emotional parts inside you, along with a core self that is like more like the internal parent or internal like boss, the organizer, the one that controls what goes on,
Yeah.
hopefully.
It's funny they say it's like family systems, but like describing it in terms of a business, I think makes a lot more sense because it's easier to assign those roles. Like this, like saying the self is the CEO is very good. Protectors are like security, and then you have managers and things. So But whatever, it's just an
I
analogy,
agree.
whatever helps you conceptualize it. So you could look at it as a family, and you could look at the self as like the mother or father, the prime parental figure,
Yeah.
you know. So
I
yeah.
I came up with a couple of things that are really really interesting. I think about it. So one of them is what they call the five assumptions. There are five basic assumptions to the IFS model. So they are as follows, according to this is from goodtherapy.org, where it talks about different modalities of therapy and such. So it's number one, the human mind is subdivided into an unknown number of parts. Number two, each person has a self, and the self should be the chief agent in coordinating the inner family. Number three, and this is a huge one that kind of goes back to that status quo and those roles. Parts engaging in non extreme behavior are beneficial to the individual. There is no such thing as a bad part. Therapy aims to help parts discover their non extreme roles, right? And then
Yeah,
number
that is
four,
very important. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. And number
Yeah.
four leads into that. As personal growth and development leads to the development of the internal family, interaction between parts become more complex, allowing for systems theory to be applied to the internal system. Reorganization of the internal system may lead to rapid changes in the roles of the parts. And finally, adjustments made to the internal system will result in changes to the external system and vice versa. Therefore, both the internal and external systems should be adequately assessed. So there's kind of five principles that were made in the development. And so yeah, let's hit on that one right there, which is there are no bad parts. So if you have a part of you that's misbehaving, and the idea this is also easily relatable to when people say something like, well, I kind of want to go to the party. I kind of want to stay home. So in this model, you would say, well, there's a part of me has become emotionally activated to tell me to avoid the party. Another part of me has become emotionally activated to tell me I need to go to the party. And now they're in conflict with each other and there's friction internally, right?
Oh yeah,
A little more
absolutely.
wordy.
No, and that's a good way of looking at it. And I think if you look at like the extreme examples, right? Like so when Schwartz was talking about working with people with bulimia, right? He realized the way they were describing their condition was there was a part that would make them binge, then a part that would make them feel shame, and that's what would make them purge, right? So you actually had this intense critic part, and then you had this other which would be more like the firefighter part, the extreme indulgences that like people have. So if you're feeling really stressed and your idea is to binge on like chocolate or ice cream or something, that's a part that is being activated to shield you from whatever those negative emotions are. And then usually when those parts get activated, they then activate like a manager part that's the critic and says, I can't believe you did that. And the parts tend to not like each other. But if you, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I need to pause just for a second. My primary recorder had a problem. Hang on.
Oh, okay. Yeah. And we were doing the show, we had one guest. He's like, should I record locally? And we were like, no, because Zencaster does it and this, that, and the other thing. And his file corrupted. And we were like, son of a gun. So now whenever someone asks if they can record locally, we're like, yeah, okay.
Yeah, please do. Please do.
Yeah, go for it.
So, all right. So yeah, a little SD card fiasco. We're back and all that. So where were we? We were just talking about the family
Well,
systems and
so I
yeah,
was just, and so I just kind of want to make that last connection between when we're talking about internal parts in the external family, just to put a bow on that. So I was talking about the extreme critic part, the binge eater parts. So in the external family model, that would be like the kid who had to take on a role that they weren't ready for. These parts in your internal system are taking on roles they're not equipped for because you didn't have the self energy or to deal with those problems when they arose. And that's what makes these parts come out. And that's what makes them act up when, Dwight, you were talking about parts that are acting out in extreme ways. That's why they're doing it, because that's the only thing they know how to do. They got forced into that role that they don't really like. And all they have is a hammer. Everything looks like a nail. They have a concept of you as probably still being a child. So that gets to that inner child thing you were talking about. Those parts don't look at the self. They don't see, in my example, they don't see a grown man like 6'4", right? They see me when I'm like 2 years old or younger or a different age. And that's how they act because they don't trust yourself to handle those intense emotions. So it's just like the kids who have to make the lunch, who have to cook the dinner. They're taking on those roles that they're not actually equipped to do, but they were forced to do it. Because what would those kids rather be doing? If you talk to a 10-year-old girl who had to make dinner for her family every night, she'd tell you she'd rather be playing with Barbies or or Tonka trucks, it's 2022, so she could play with whatever she wants, but she wouldn't want to be cooking dinner. That's my point. She would want to be a kid. And it's the same thing on the internal side too.
Absolutely. It gets into they say that there are three types of parts, right? Managers, exiles, and firefighters. And managers and firefighters are both under what they call the protector role.
Yes.
Exiles are the protected role that you see. So managers are, and once again, this is where the business metaphor works really well, because managers are responsible for kind of conscious daily life and those kind of productive behaviors. I'm doing an air quotes though, because it's not always, it's just like how drinking yourself to sleep is a solution, right?
Yeah.
Because it's an attempted solution. And managers, this is my little analogy for them, which is Finding Nemo. If you think of Finding Nemo, you've got Marlin, who's the dad,
Yeah.
and he loses almost his entire family in one, like predatory fish attack, where his wife and all their eggs are eaten except for one, of course, which is Nemo. And he's very protective of his son. And his method of being protective and making sure his son has a happy, healthy life is don't let him do anything.
Yeah.
You can't go out, you can't go to school. Let's wait a whole year. I know you want to go to school. I know you'd like to be adventurous, but you're not allowed to because I can't lose you. And it's well intentioned. That's why this is the analogy I use. Is at no time do you feel like Marlin dislikes Nemo at all, or does anything other than cares a great deal for him. But his own fear and the best he can do to protect him is not to allow him to do anything. So you have a manager part inside yourself that says, that's the part that says, don't go to the party, don't be social, don't care if it's a goal of yours, don't care if you're lonely. You just can't, because if you do that, maybe you'll be rejected. So I'm protecting you.
That is a great analogy. And just to circle back with that, think about how Marlin is thinking about Nemo. He's still thinking about Nemo as the little egg, as the little fish. He doesn't see how Nemo grew up. And that's what your manager parts are. They don't see that you've grown up. So yeah, no, that's a great analogy. I love that. It hits the nail right on the head.
Well, finding analogies and summaries is half of what therapy is.
If you told someone we were talking about internal family systems and you were going to mention a Pixar movie, everyone would think you would mention Inside Out, but no, it's Finding Nemo. Finding Nemo's the IFS movie.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
no, that's
great.
true. That one goes very well. And you got also firefighters, which is an interesting thing that I think, because in my mind, I always latched onto, protectors and protected, got it. But it's significant once you learn the difference here, because firefighters, you can talk about that if you want.
Well, okay, a firefighter. So these tend to be the parts that are really acting out. So if you go to internal family system therapy, there's a very good chance that you'll be working with a lot of firefighters first. Those are like, I got to do something about my anger, right? Or I got to do something about my drinking or my pornography consumption. Those things, the things that other parts of your system usually don't like firefighters at all. That's where those extreme critics come in. They're tend to be very critical of firefighters. But think about what a firefighter does in real life. They're standing by, they're waiting, they get the call, and they go headlong into the fire and they put it out. And these firefighter parts, they do the same thing. So if you get hit with an extreme emotion, maybe it's a breakup, or maybe it's just something that has to do with your relationship with like your mother or father, and when you're in the same room with them, you got that part that's screaming, I gotta get out here. That's the firefighter. And those tend to manifest themselves in those extreme acts that then manager parts will come in and say, why did you do that? What are you doing here? So the firefighters tend to be those extreme acting out parts, I think, would be the best way to think of them. Again, there's no bad part. The firefighters doing this because it's what they know how to do. It's a role that they were forced to take on to protect you from this pain. Like if they're not protecting you in their mind, it could be even go up to you dying. They can't conceptualize the current, like where you are currently. Like they are stuck in that role. They are stuck with a certain idea of you and how you handle these situations.
And it's interesting because even a suicidal part would be characterized as a firefighter, could be characterized
Oh
as a
yeah,
firefighter, because suicide's not crazy. What it is a sort of misallocated solution attempt, right? To put it that way. It's like there's a part of us that's saying like, well, if things are terrible and they will never improve, if that's literally true, suicide becomes a viable option to end pain. That's why I've always felt like, the problem isn't so much the desire for suicide as much as it is the belief that everything's terrible and the belief that it can never get better, right? To the degree that I doubt those things and actually start to think, well, maybe not everything's bad and maybe things could improve, suicidality usually drops considerably, right? If we have those kinds of things, if there's hope, right? In other words. And so, but it's interesting because there's still a part of us that wants to stop pain. That's why it goes there, right? And it's easy to lash out at that part. And this is where I think one of the big things about internal family systems, we keep saying there's no bad parts. The book by Richard Schwartz. That's one of the books, right?
Yes, that's the one I read in preparation for the show recently. I read his two other books a couple years ago too. So
that's his newest one, right?
That's that's the newest one. Yeah. And that's the one where I have a few concerns that we could talk about at the end of the show too.
Nice.
Yes.
It's always good to have something to balance us out. But I really love the idea that this is where it's a strength-based model, in my opinion, because you get into the idea that you've got this part of you that actually cares about you, that loves you, and it has been working really hard, maybe for a long, long, long time. And most of the time it's been getting hate as its response, right? Because we hate this part, and this part makes
actually,
me
I want to stop you right there when you say we hate this part. It's the other parts in your system that hate it. Yourself doesn't hate parts. We'll probably get to that a little bit where you talk about. So a manager is a very self-like part. There's a lot of times where you think you're acting with self-energy and it's actually just a very self-like part. And those are very useful. Yeah. Those are the things that probably let you like look at an Excel spreadsheet all day to do your job.
Get up and make breakfast for everyone when you're
the very good part to have, and they tend to hate the firefighters of the extreme acting out parts, and so when you say you hate these parts, it's really a self-like part that hates it, because your actual self will never hate. And that's part of the therapy model, which we'll probably get into in a little bit more. I'll let you wrap up your point, though.
No, that's a great point, because one of the big parts of IFS is actually trying to disentangle the parts from the self.
Yes, right? Schwartz calls it unblending. You have to unblend the parts from the self, which is not easy to do. That's one of the things. You read these books and the examples he gives, he's always very quick to qualify, like, it usually doesn't go this fast. I'm putting it in here just as an example. And you really should do this work with an actual therapist who's trained in this system. So when Dwight and I talk about some of the work that you do, we're talking on a conceptual level. This isn't a follow along at home thing. You know what I mean? You can read the book, find an IFS therapist if the kind of work we're talking about sounds appealing to you. But we're just talking about this for because we're fanboys of it, so like don't we're not guiding you through it. We're going to explain how it works, though.
I will say, yes, we're going to get into it in just a second. I will say you can adapt, and some people have adapted some of the exercises into sort of at-home meditative processes. It's just focused on the parts. I will say that I would suggest that it's not that you shouldn't necessarily, I guess if you try it with meditation, whatever, it's going to be much, much more powerful if you have worked with a therapist and then are doing some exercises at home, because you'll have been through this process before. You know what it's supposed to feel like. In fact, one of the books that I have on my shelf is self-therapy workbook it's full of exercises for the IFS process by Bonnie J.Y. Celsius W. But she is very, very, throughout the whole thing, a lot of it is guided meditation and using the concept for your day-to-day life. And when you read it, is intended to go along with guided therapy by somebody who's doing it with you, because it's much, much more
Yeah.
powerful to do it in therapy with someone obviously who's doing therapy. You can't do therapy to yourself. You can do self-help, but it's different,
Yeah.
a little
And
different.
one of the reasons it's beneficial to work with a therapist, or just you have to work with someone who has the concept of self energy, because it would be very easy for a self like part to take over that process to move things along with your day. It's like, oh, hey, look, we're doing it. You're in self. This is self. I'm talking to you now. And it's
Yeah.
not actually self, and so
That's a huge
so
part right
yeah,
there,
that is a
is to
huge part
work
of
with
it.
someone, working with
So
someone
they
who's
could call you out
experiencing.
on it.
Yeah,
Exactly.
exactly, right,
Yeah.
recognizing where you're at. Have you come across the 8 C's? That's something that my therapist always would mention, the 8 C's of self. C's of self,
Yes, yes. I
spelled with
don't
a
have
C.
them. I don't have them memorized, but I do have the book. It's
Oh
like
no, it
a.
wasn't. I got him here. I
Oh,
got him right
oh,
here.
okay.
I don't have them memorized either, but that wasn't a test. It was just.
Oh, okay.
But you know what? You passed because of honesty.
Yeah. Oh, well,
Um,
see, there you go. I have a part that likes to be very honest, but also likes getting adulation. And that's probably why I came on the show. So I had a part that really wanted to show how smart I was, knowing all this internal family system stuff.
so the 8 C's are compassion, connection, courage, clarity, curiosity, creativity, confidence, and calm. And I will say that's something that each of the times, and this is a good time for us to probably segue into what this looks like if you're practically sitting in session.
Mm.
The therapist I was working with, she would actually go through these. In the very beginning, a lot of times there is a meditative process right out of the gate, which is focus internally, right? Focus internally. And the way it was done with me was always like focus internally and go to that place inside yourself, deep inside yourself, where you can be compassionate, where you can be connected, where you feel yourself able to have courage and clarity, curiosity, where you're free to be creative. You can be confident, you're calm, some version of that those would be. And as somebody's going through that, for me anyway, that gives me a really good image of where I'm trying to get to, that there's somewhere inside myself. If I can be those 8 things, that's that's my self, right? That is the me that's not
Yeah,
so insecure and
they
bogged
would
down
say
with things.
you're in self energy
Mhm.
when you reach that state. And in the actual so in the work I did with my therapist, it was basically the same idea, where it's like, let's look inside and let's get curious about a part, right? So if there were, let's just, for a hypothetical, let's say you have a procrastination issue, and
Massive
that's the
homicidal. Oh wait, no, no,
no.
procrastination. Let's do that. Let's do that.
Well, in Schwartz's book No Bad Parts, he does talk about working with like murderers, sex criminals, like the worst of the worst, and talking about how those are still parts, and it's just like, whoa, boy, dude, don't bite off more than you can chew here. That's a lot for people to take in.
No,
So
no, but
let's,
yeah,
yeah,
it's absolutely true.
yeah,
PTSD, or I have a colleague who works almost exclusively with people with sex addiction, in the form of even people who are struggling against pedophilic urges and trying to
mm,
repair this. And they use a lot of this as well as EDMR and some things like that. Seems to help people. So anyway,
yeah.
procrastination. Let's do
Yeah,
that.
so let's say you were curious about a procrastination part. And so what your therapist would say typically is like, well, like, go inside. Are you close to it? How do you feel about it? And sometimes people would say, you might say, oh, I don't like this part because I hate procrastinating. Well, that's a manager. That's not your self energy. And so what the therapist would say is like, could you please ask that part to step aside so you can work with the procrastination part? And when that happens and you get into that curiosity state, that's how you feel towards that part. You don't, there's not that hatred anymore. It is a place of love and curiosity, and you want to get to know them. And now that part can start trusting you, trusting yourself to tell you what's going on, like what they're doing. It's like, why do you procrastinate? It's like, and they'll tell you, it's like, I don't procrastinate because I hate you. I procrastinate because if you do the work and you do it wrong, you're going to get in trouble. Think about like if you did a school assignment wrong and the teacher yells at you or something, like that's the kind of stuff they're trying to avoid. And now your job is to work with that part so it can understand, like, okay, I appreciate that, I value that, I honor that, but I'm a grown man now, and we can find another role for you. And to do that, we have to get to the next parts that we'll be talking about, the exiles. Like, we need to get to that exile that gets kicked up, that kicks up these emotions that make you come out and make us procrastinate.
And
And so
that's a
that, yeah.
huge part. Yeah, that.
Oh yeah, no,
that
that's big. And this is where working
yeah.
with a therapist is very important. Dealing with exiles is not a casual matter, so it's one thing to go inside by yourself and get familiar with your parts and have a dialogue that's very healthy. Actually, there's a great self-leadership exercise that Schwartz has in the book that I would encourage people to do if they're curious. And the idea is you go inside, you see the parts, and you tell them that you're basically going for a walk. Just imagine a path that you can go on where you leave them behind for a little bit, and you're going to come back. You're not abandoning them. It's impossible to abandon them because they're still there, but it's like, I'm like just myself, I'm going alone. And that feeling, if you're able to do it right, that you'll get, because you will get a feeling, that's self-energy, so that's a useful exercise that you can do at home, I would say. Yeah.
One of the most important parts that I found beneficial is what you mentioned, where there'll be a focusing on a part. It's like, what part is presenting itself today, or what's bothering you, or let's work on that part. And then, it'll slip right by and it'll say, like, how do you feel as you picture this part? And oftentimes it's a visualization of, look at this part as if it was literally, a personified in front of you, and kind of like, interpret that however you want, and whatever it looks like. But then to say, how do you feel when you look at this part? What do you think of this part? What do you feel towards this part? Oh, I feel sad. Okay, well, that's probably another part of you.
Yes,
is there
exactly.
a sad part that stood up? And that's what my therapist would always lead through by saying, like, let's ask this part if it is willing to step aside, or does it need some attention? And usually
that's important. Yeah,
you just feel it step aside. Although it has happened to me where it's like, I think this is actually more pertinent today. Okay, well, let's go back to the procrastinating part and ask if it minds if we come back to it later, which, of course, being a procrastinating part, it won't mind.
It won't. Yeah, that's a good point.
They don't usually crack jokes in the session, but that's not.
Well, I cracked a lot of jokes in my sessions.
I do too, but not during the exercise.
Yeah. No,
anyway.
that's a very good point. And again, why I think it's very important. I mean, reading the books are good, but working with a therapist is really important, because this can go in a lot of different directions. So when we talk about emotions being triggered, right, or kicked up, what Schwartz actually refers to those is trailheads, right? Because now it's not that you're triggered and everything kicks up. You have a path that you can explore now. It's like, well, okay, hold on a minute. You are feeling upset. So instead of just saying you're triggered, it's like, well, that's a trailhead. We can explore that. We can go with the parts and see where that leads. So I think I love that language of referring to them as trailheads. It's all about exploring and understanding the system, moving around, and it can really go in a lot of different ways, and it can be pretty powerful. So like you were saying, like other parts coming up, it's very important to acknowledge them for sure. Yeah. Because you'll probably have a manager part that would want to smack him down and say, get out of the way,
I have a yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And I think we all have that one. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that's where, shame, that's a part, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And that's a management, because let me there's a script here that I have. There's a bunch of these different kind of scripts that people have, either for self-guided or even for the therapist to use. But one of the things that is very interesting to me, it's like, so if you're getting to know a protector part and you're trying to form essentially you're trying to enhance the trust in the relationship, right?
Yeah.
And you assume that many times that is damaged. So some of the statements that you should make to this part would be to say, I understand why you do this, right? If you do, you can also ask, why do you do this role? But the feedback to give is things like, I appreciate you've been working so hard on my behalf. I appreciate what you originally did for me. I appreciate what you've done for me throughout my life and what you're doing for me now. I appreciate what you're trying to do. You must be under a lot of pressure, that type of thing.
Yeah.
And trying to approach this part of you in a way that is loving and shows empathy, internal empathy.
Yes.
Now,
A lot
this
of
is a
gratitude as well. Very important.
absolutely, and that,
Yeah.
that's a recurring theme during the exercise is like, ask your part this question, and then as you talk about the answer, my therapist will always say, now make sure to thank that part for answering. Say,
Yeah.
thanks for answering. Now let's move on to the next. Now, this is the part that people have the part where
Yes.
people will find that one of their parts is activated. That I find that one of the hardest things for people to focus on is this concept of talking to myself feels okay and natural, but then comes this weird part where I'm going to listen for my internal part to answer. And I'm not
Yeah.
supposed to think, what do I think they would say? I'm actually so just supposed to listen and see what kind of an emotional response and feeling that I get.
Yeah.
It's
I
not
mean, because
deducing, it's feeling.
the part won't lie to you. And at least in my work, I mean, I do like the podcast in here. I love talking. I love showing how smart I am. I have a part that loves doing that. And so even when it was doing the work, this manager part would come up and go, oh, I know what's up with this part. He does this because of X, Y, Z. So if you're thinking like that, that is a part that's coming up. What you need to do is ask them to step away and focus on the part you're dealing with, and they will be honest with you. They will tell you, it's
Yeah.
like why do you do this, and they'll tell you the straight answer. 9 times out of 10 they'll say something like, like, because you can't do it without me, like you need
Yes.
me, like if I don't do this, everyone's in trouble, like they have very serious burdens that they carry, and
And
that's part of the work is unburdening them. Yeah.
And that's exactly as I've seen people, and this is similar to some other exercises. Like in some ways, it's similar to EMDR. We're talking about a lot. In some ways, it's very similar, and I would say probably has some roots in like NLP or neuro linguistic programming, which has a lot to do with talking to your former child self and giving it resources and kind of stepping back in time, and you envision a portal and you find your little child self and they need to be brave. Well, I guess what, I'm here for you. I got some bravery you can use.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of like, it's reminiscent for me of that kind of thing, to where you are using that. But one of the things it has in common is this concept, which is listen for an answer and you'll get one. And the idea is that if you really are investing and you're focusing your energy your attention internally, you really do get a feel for an answer if you will listen for one. And that's the part that people aren't really sure about, kind of thing. Well, aren't I imagining this? And
Yeah,
the
you're gonna
theory would
have.
go, no,
Yeah.
not exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, you're probably going to have skeptical parts when you're starting with this, because I even have a part of me that knows when we're talking about it, like it just sounds so out there. That's why, again, I think it's really important to do it with someone who knows what they're doing. But like, so sticking with that, like the internal child, following through with the work. So this hypothetical session that Dwight and I are working through with the procrastinator part, we're moving at light speed. This could take a year to do the kind of stuff we're talking about. But anyway, so let's say you get that trusting relationship with the procrastinator part. What he'll do now, or she, however the part identifies, like you could probably be a dude with women parts, and edit that out. There's got to be a better way for me to say that. But anyway, so the
I'm
procrastinator
going to make
part,
that my ringtone, actually.
you could be a dude with woman parts. Anyway, the protector now, the procrastinator, is going to bring you back, and he's going to show you what is called the exile. And what this is going to be, that is going to be that small childlike form of yours that some trauma got them stuck. And the best way to not feel that trauma manifested itself through procrastination. So this procrastinator part, he was doing something else in your system. Maybe something small. Maybe he was like, man, collecting bugs is fun. And then this trauma happens. He's like, well, can't collect bugs anymore. I got to be this procrastinator part so I can, make sure no one dies because of this trauma he's feeling. And now so he brings you back to the exile, and now you have to do the same exact work again with the exile. You need to show them who you are. You need to show them yourself. You need to make sure other parts that are coming in, because lots of parts won't like you working with exiles at all. So they'll come up, you ask them to step aside, and now you form a relationship with the exile. You let the exile, this is very simplistic. There's a lot more to it. But the goal is with the exile is it will ask you for something like, what do you need from me? And it's like what you were talking about, going through that portal, being brave with it, or maybe confronting a teacher, or standing up for themselves. It could be something really innocuous. It could be like, hey, don't let the kid knock over my ice cream. It could be something very serious. It could be something, and to us, of course, because we're adults looking at this to go like, that's it. So maybe you have a part that's like, that's what you're upset about. But when you're in that relationship with the exile and you feel that love and understanding to them, and you help them heal, they'll unburden themselves to you. And now they're a normal, I don't want to say normal, but now they are functioning in a role in your system that they were meant to do. And now your protector can also shift into another role. And to get a little personal for people, one of the things that internal family systems helped me out a lot with was anger management. And getting that anger, like firefighter protector, to move into a different space, addressing that exile that I had inside me, that was very powerful stuff. And it lasts and it works. It's just like, I don't feel anger that way anymore.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like I guess if you hit me with a baseball bat, I'd get angry, right? But like little things,
So it's
like
not
if I
perfect yet.
yeah,
No,
exactly. But like
no, it is
knocking
interesting
over a
though.
can of soda and like swearing like, oh, son of a, but now like, so that's
And
the
I
healing
process.
process,
And I
and again,
found that,
that's very simplistic. There's a
sure.
lot more to it, but the idea is basically meet the protector shows you to the exile unburdens themselves to you, because you're strong enough now. The self is very strong. You keep talking about strength, and you know how much I love strength training. This is very similar to that, and you take that pain, you carry it now, and the self is strong enough to do it. That's what is so awesome about the self. It is strong enough for all that pain in your system. You can manage it all through self energy, but it's just a matter of working with your system to get it. I can't say you'll ever heal everything, but if you can take care of some really big stuff, you're going to see dramatic changes in your life doing this kind of work, and doing it consistently, for sure.
And even just the concept of the differentiation between self and these parts is already very powerful, I find,
Oh
because
yeah.
then you're not once you get this vocabulary down, you're not telling yourself, oh, I'm an angry person. You were saying, oh, I have a part or some parts of me that seem to be easily activated, or might be, I have a fireman part that just ironically wants to burn everything down as a
Yeah.
way to protect me, or to protect something, or because of an intention that deep down is a good intention. The other thing, and as you mentioned, there's not a recommended speed of recovery. I will
Mm-hmm.
say, however, my experience is when I have done this kind of work, I found that I recovered through or worked through some feelings much, much faster than other therapy. And so, not to put that
Yeah.
expectation that it's magic or anything, but I will say that it would be up there with some techniques that can make some meaningful difference in how you're feeling pretty soon. And
Yeah, I
may
agree.
work and resolve
Yeah.
more, but the idea that, oh, this can actually, day one you can feel the powerfulness or the power of the feelings rubbing
Yes.
into each other, and that sometimes already starts to because you can't pay attention to anything without it starting to change.
Yeah, exactly. So, like on day one, you're not changing the procrastinator part, just to keep running with that example. However, on day one, you've just built more trust with the procrastinator part. And that part is going to start trusting your self leadership
Yeah.
a little more. Not always. They're still going to have that job until you can heal and move on. But on day one, you can start building that trust, and that will start affecting your relationship with like how you see procrastination. Like you'll be very aware of when that part comes up, and
Yeah.
and then it could very well be that, like, because we're talking about procrastination in a firefighter role, so it's something that's probably causing you harm at work, right? Like you're putting off your TCP reports till the very end of the week when you know you shouldn't. So
Yeah.
now maybe your procrastinator part, once you take care of that exile, maybe he wants to be what's called an advisor now, right? Which is like a type of manager kind of. So it's an advisor part where it's like, you know what, maybe we can procrastinate on this, but it's not in that knee-jerk way anymore, so
It's
now
not,
maybe
yeah.
he has kind of the same job but in a much healthier way for your system.
And kind of goes back to that thought, yeah, with those 5 pillars, right? Or
Mm-hmm.
5 pillars, that's Islam. But there is, so I'm glad I remember that from school. So, I did learn something about other cultures. But anyway, those 5 assumptions, and one of them
Yeah,
is that in non-extreme ways, that these things all often are actually good. And that's one
yeah,
of the things I really like about the model. Another thing about the model that then this is a good segue into the criticisms, because some people don't like this. I
okay.
kind of like this, but it is a non-diagnostic model. In other words, IFS,
Mm,
if you're doing IFS treatment, it is not diagnosis dependent. In fact, at its core, it's not really worried about any of that. It's like if you say, well, I'm working with, my bipolar parts. It's like, well, that's not a part really. Let's break it down into the emotions, right, that we're running into.
yeah,
It's like,
that's
okay, well,
something Schwartz talks about in the new book he mentions, and when he talks about like the use of medications and psychedelics for this kind of work, it's like the medications and the psychedelics can either enhance your feelings of a part or dull a part, like maybe tone down a part chemically so you can work with an exile better or something. So
yeah,
it's
I don't
some
think it's anti-medicine. I don't think it's
no,
anti-medicine.
it's
Just
not.
yeah.
Well, if anything, it's getting borderline pro psychedelic, which maybe that's a criticism. I'm just an old fuddy duddy, so I'm like,
There's
you
a lot of
hippies.
research
I
now
don't.
being done about that. Sure, right.
Hippies take LSD. Not good, upstanding people like me. So
What part is that? Let's work on that
yeah.
part. Yeah.
Well, that's the good, upstanding part. I like him. He can stay. As soon as he's gone, bam, LSD all the time.
It's the one, wow, the last line of defense.
Yeah, I know. Well, and so actually, I think that is a good point. The non-diagnostic model. I like that you would think of that being a therapist. Where I'm looking at it from a cultural point of view. Are you familiar with the works of Arthur Brooks? He's like a happiness professor at Harvard. Bald guy, used to play the French horn. Absolutely brilliant. And he just came out with a book called From Strength to Strength. And the thesis statement behind that book is essentially, as you grow older, you kind of stop doing the things you love and you start teaching the things you love. And I'm seeing that with Richard Schwartz. I listened to a lot of interviews with him leading up to this. And you can see he's moving into that mold. And what worries me is that if he moves too far, we're going to see like a gurufication of Schwartz, which is kind of funny because in his book he warns about like gurus and things like that. But I think he has a part of himself that's keeping him blind to how a lot of people talk about him. I mean, when he's on these shows, I mean, these people are like in awe of him, and I appreciate the work he's done. He's done a lot of really good work, but then in the book, No Bad Parts, he's talking about how internal family systems, like if it's like, imagine if everyone in the world was doing this, like if world leaders could see themselves, like all the problems we could solve if we looked at problems this way and that way, talking about like homelessness and things, like very lofty, ambitious things. And I'm like, dude, that you made a really good system to help people work through trauma. I don't think you can, and maybe I'm wrong, I just don't think it expands and grows globally as a movement in that way. I think I'm worried about him not staying in his lane moving forward. And I'm worried about people putting an IFS stamp on anything that they deem is good to give it more credibility, so that's why I'm worried about as from a cultural point of view.
Mhm.
As far as a criticism for it as a therapy, I think if you're a smart person, you can game it. If you're going to a therapist and you're doing this system, you can have a part that will be able to tell them exactly what they want to hear, and you can lie. I mean, look, you're only hurting yourself,
Obviously.
obviously, and but that's probably and that's a protector part who doesn't trust therapy. That's obviously doing all that, but like there's no real check on it. Like you have to be honest and open. So it seems very feasible to me that someone could be working in IFS with an IFS professional, and you could game it and not actually get any work done, and you would really have no way of knowing. Like there's really nothing quantitative about the process, and that could be scary if you have people who like, oh yeah, I'm feeling the self energy and stuff like that, and if they're just BSing, well, you're wasting a therapist's time. You're not getting the help you actually need, and it could be throwing off studies into this, because it is a researched model. Like there are papers about this. They've had groups that they've studied that do this. So
Yeah,
that is one thing that worries me, is like it could be gamed.
One of the things, and I'll say though too, I think you can extend that complaint to most modes of therapy and things.
Yeah,
but
you
I
probably
think
could. Yeah.
no, but I think with the specific one, it is interesting because you can see how this could lend itself. I see what you mean by the guruification. I like that.
Yeah.
Of things.
It is not a real word. I have it typed in my notes and it has a red squiggly line on it, but I have guruification. So
maybe you're just ahead of your time. You're
I
some kind of guru.
Hey.
No, in fact,
he's the guy that warned about the gurus. He's great.
He's great. So thank goodness we have him.
Yeah.
So it was. I came across this, as far as the evidence-based is a big buzzword in medical care, but it means are there studies and things. And it was in 2015, IFS was added to a big list of evidence-based practices by Sam Shaw, which is Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. That's what I call them, is Sam Shaw. But
nice.
That's something that is on there, and I think you're absolutely right. I see that. I mean, similar thing there. It's such an exciting time that there's a lot of different things that seem to be quite effective that are being used now, and even some of them kind of quicker results, and at least relieving of pressure and things like that. There's some indication that some of the modern treatments will drastically eliminate suicidal things, and we see that with ketamine therapy and different things like that. And I've highlighted a lot of those things on these episodes of the show. They're very, very good. I think that it's hard. It's very hard. Even when professionals say this is not a panacea, we all go, great, I found a panacea.
Yeah.
As soon as we find something that works, we tend to want it to do more than it's meant to do.
Yeah,
and this is meant to be a part of treatment.
If you lost a lot of weight doing CrossFit, you're going to go around telling everyone, "Oh, CrossFit's the best way to lose weight." I mean, it's that. I mean, that. Hey, I tell everyone the best way to do therapy is internal family systems. Because
right,
that's what I know. But it is a fair point, and it is hot now. And you just worry, like, what do we not know? So you're nervous about putting too much stock in it. But I mean, some of the results just really speak for themselves. I mean, like people I know that I've talked to, and you listen to these podcasts. Oh, so here's another criticism I have. In the book, he does mention a lot, do this with a professional, and he gives dialogues, and the work is moving incredibly fast in those dialogues. And then at the end, he throws in the pro forma, like, normally it doesn't move this fast. You know what I mean? But that's like having like the jack dude on the Bowflex. It's like results not typical. It's like people aren't looking at results not typical. They're seeing the huge dude, and it's like, well, I need to get a Bowflex now. So I'm worried that even though he is very careful in his language, it might still just be a little too cute by half, where it's like, look, these kind of results aren't typical, but look what happens when you do get results like this. Right. So again, I don't think he's trying to scam anyone, but when you listen to him do interviews, like he did another podcast, and he actually does a bit of session work with the woman host, and she basically kind of has a breakthrough right there on the podcast, and it's like, that's pretty advanced work to all be happening all at once. Like, is she
Sure.
and she even mentions like, well, maybe I have a part that just wants to impress you too. So, I mean, I do think there is more self-awareness
Yeah.
than maybe people would want to give it credit for, but at the same time, I'm just worried about some of these blind spots, and I would just hate for it to blow up in the wrong direction, because I
I
do
think
think it is
it's a
very
good
effective.
point.
Yeah.
And I would say that even though you might go in and have like a more successful, and you might have a breakthrough, you might have one day one, you might have one the third time, you might have one the 33rd time you do this or something. But the
Yeah.
fact is that even if you have a breakthrough, this is a common, mistake people might make with therapy. It's like, if I have a tremendously successful session and a highly emotional result, it doesn't mean that I'm like everything's fine now. And that's something to be careful of. And I think a
Mm-hmm.
lot of therapists have had this experience with clients, and a lot of people have had this experience in therapy where, I'm doing okay now. And by now I mean pretty soon after starting, I'm feeling better. So I'm going to start coming in, or I'm going to start coming in much, much less frequent. And once again, in some cases, that works out just fine. I mean, you get to take responsibility for your own medical care.
Yeah.
However, I always say, it's tricky, and this is especially true if you bring your kid in. A lot of people are like, "Yeah, they've had a couple good weeks, so I don't think we need to come in for a month." And it's like, and then sometimes they come back in a month and go, "Holy cow, it was a rough month." And it's like, well, we kind of interrupted therapy, and also
Yeah.
that's a good way to tell whether or not it's working, and there's still something to work on. So just like there's no bad parts. I don't ever shame people for the way that they engage with treatment. But I know for myself, I have that part of me that's like, everything's fine, everything's fine, everything's fine. I mean, that's probably
Yeah.
the biggest part of my own like mental unhealth or pathology, is the trying to make everything fine, just make everything fine. It's got to be fine. And so it's like, oh, I had a couple good weeks and I had three really good sessions. I guess, maybe things are better. They're not better. They're just
Yeah.
getting in the right direction.
Oh, there's a story I want to tell real quick about a personal friend of mine. He had one of those worst days of his life kind of thing. Police were involved, was arrested. He's doing great now. And I was talking to him, and he, for a unrelated matter, he had to look at the police report from that day, and he read it, and he was talking to me about it. And you could see he was getting very emotional, and then he just started crying, and he hugged me, and he said, you know, I was he said I was healed. I was over that. Yeah, like I like that was done, and now it's all coming back. And all I was thinking was like, man, no, you weren't. You just had really strong parts that were protecting you, and now you're really feeling that pain. And I didn't tell him this. This is just kind of what I was thinking. I reassured him and said, like, I did recommend that he see a therapist, in which he actually started doing at my recommendation, but like, that's all I could think of is like, how many people out there think like they've healed something, but they didn't really. They just have a very strong protector. And until you can actually get in and heal that trauma, you will carry it around with you, and it will manifest itself in your life in ways that you probably don't want it to do. So,
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why it is so powerful to reiterate that whole idea of like, oh, that's a sad part of you. Let's ask that part of you to
yeah.
excuse itself. That's a shame, right? That's a guilty, shameful part of you. Let's ask that one to step aside and
Hmm.
now get back to talking to this one. What I found is that even if I would tend to shy away, even if it's kind of subconscious, but shy away from that part because it's hard to talk to that part. It's hard to focus on it. I'd rather focus on the shame part for a minute,
Yeah.
and deal with, I'm ashamed. It's like, okay, well, you're not ashamed. You have a shameful part. Let's ask that part if it'll wait, and we can talk to it later if it needs it. Oh, okay. Back to the main thing. Back to procrastination. We got to get right back on it.
Hmm.
There is an easy there. There's a It lends itself to focus, high focus on something, and then
Yeah.
it starts to change. So this has been really cool, as I knew it would be, to be able to talk about this.
Yeah.
And it's also fun, although I've been learning about this and I've been using it, as well as I just did some EMDR training and stuff. It's a newer thing for me to add into my practice. So I will say, the majority of my experience with it was as a patient, and then learning it since then and getting to use it as a therapist has been very exciting. But it's nice to be able to sit down and talk about this as consumers of mental health, which I'm often
Yeah.
at least in the seat of both, but I guess I'm somewhat that hat, but it's, it's nice to be able to talk about just as recipients of that. Well,
Yeah, and again, I really just want to say again for the record, I am just an enthusiast. I've just done
yeah,
some independent research. I've read the books and I'm a fan. So if I got a few things wrong, or if you have quibbles or qualms, if you're an actual medical professional, it's like Dwight, why'd you have this hack on your show? He's making you look bad. I apologize in advance. This is just one man's interpretation, and I really appreciate the opportunity for having me on to talk about it. And I do think if you're considering therapy out there, loyal listeners, which you might be because you clicked on a podcast about it, look into an IFS practitioner. I don't think you'll regret it, So
yeah.
that's my word of advice there to wrap the show up on. And Dr. Schwartz, if you're listening, I am a big fan of your work, but please be careful about becoming a guru in your golden years. Okay, so there we go. I'm going to throw that out there.